I would argue that the golden age of China is before 6th century,
Before 6th century. Wow.
when China clearly led the rest of the world in technology, in inventions, and in science.
Dr. Huang, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. Let's start our conversation by directly going to your book. It is titled The Rise and Fall of the East: How Exams, Autocracy, Stability, and Technology Brought China Success and Might Lead to Its Decline. What I want to know is this: what perspective do you bring in this book that is new, given there are so many books about China?
Yeah. Thank you, Adele. First of all, I'm very happy to be on your show. And that's an excellent question to start the conversation. Um, I think one thing that's new, there are several things that's new, but let me start with this one. One thing that's new is I think my book is more nuanced and more balanced about China's successes and failures than previous treatments.
China's
And
failures, is that what you said?
oh yeah, I
Oh.
mean, oh, communist China, Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution,
Yep.
20 million people starved to death. I will count those as failures.
Yep.
So for one thing, um, it is important for your viewers and for your audience to know that when we talk about China, we're not just talking about China since 1978, right? And because since 1978, Chinese economy has boomed, has grown very fast. And that's sort of the perspective that many people have of China. But China has a very long history.
Yeah.
And during that long history, it also had periods of boom and bust and gigantic failures and substantial successes, right? So let's be clear about that baseline of facts. And I think one perspective I brought into the discussion is that the view that a country succeeds on a balance of two forces. One I call scale, and the other I call scope. Right? Scale means basically homogeneity. Scope means heterogeneity. Right? So a country needs to have an optimal balance of these two forces. It needs to be homogeneous on some dimensions. It needs to be heterogeneous on other dimensions. So if you look at,
Dr.
yeah,
Huang, when you say homogeneous and heterogeneous, you're not necessarily talking about ethnicities and race. You're also
yeah,
talking in this sort of technical innovation, financial and economic sense.
yeah, I'm not talking about things like geography, rivers and terrains and landscapes. These are kind of a natural conditions. When I say homogeneous and heterogeneous, I mainly mean uh, human created conditions, right? So
Human
autocracy,
creative conditions. Okay.
yeah. So for example, autocracy, right? In my book, that's that's a system about homogeneity, one ideology, one ruling party, one ruler. Um, and democracy, in my book, is heterogeneous, multiple parties, multiple ideologies, elections, and multiple rulers. So in my book, I mainly talk about these issues, institutions, politics, and economy, rather than geography and those type of things. So, yeah,
And uh, 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 and it's interesting. It's a little bit of a play with words, but it makes a lot of sense. You use the word East, as in the rise and the fall of the East, in all caps, and the East stands for something, right?
Yeah. So in this telling, East stands for exam, autocracy, stability, and technology. And so it has sort of four elements, and they are linked with each other through this homogeneous, heterogeneous framework that I laid out. And I trace a lot of the kind of political economic development and the characteristics of those developments. So the first letter of this acronym, E, exam,
Mm-hmm.
that was a civil service exam system that was established in the 6th century. And I went through the details of that system and how that system homogenized ideas and consolidated autocratic rule. And it has left a profound legacy on China today. Right. So that's kind of the underlying theme of the whole book.
We're going to actually get to these four elements because reading about your book and preparing for this conversation, I'm really fascinated by how you develop the history of each element and tie it to current China under CCP. But what I'm wondering is this: is the coexistence or convergence of these four elements in the East, all caps, um, is it unique to China's history?
It is unique in the sense that exam system, as far as I know, is unique to Chinese civilization. Unique in the sense that in other civilizations, you had that much later, and
Yeah,
they tended to be pale emulations of the Chinese system. And so if you look at other systems, they use hereditary system, right?
yeah,
Bloodline as a way to promote political appointees, and or you use military conquest as a test. Right? So you can think about that as a test as well, but except it is more about military power rather than your mental power to process information. As far as I know, I can be corrected on this, and your audience may know better. China not only is the first country to use this system, it is so far ahead of other civilizations in the duration and uniformity and the scale of that system, right? So in that sense, it is unique.
in many countries in Europe, and we'll get into this in more detail, offices, including bureaucratic offices, were actually bought. There were things that the
Yeah,
monarch sold to make money. For example, in France. Earlier, you mentioned two things that really caught my attention. Right off the bat in our conversation, you said China's failure, and then several moments later, you said gigantic failures. I want to know a couple of things. I'm just curious now. Is there one particular epoch that stands out as China's golden age?
yeah.
Oh, we're going to talk about one because that's an important question. China has such a long history, right?
So I would argue that the golden age of China is before 6th century,
Before 6th century. Wow.
when China clearly led the rest of the world in technology, in inventions, and in science. We're not sure whether or not China led the rest of the world in terms of living standard, because that's a little bit tricky concept.
Yeah.
It's on a per capita basis,
Hmm.
and it's likely that all the civilizations had about the same per capita living standard. But in terms of aggregate, there's fairly substantial evidence that China led the rest of the world in science and technology. So
When you said
relative,
led, by how far? By how much?
it,
What?
it, it, it's this is qualitative judgment
Uh-huh.
by historians, and I have to say I don't have a way to quantitatively challenge or verify that conclusion. The reason is that uh, we can go into that later on. We created a database on Chinese inventions, and there's not a similar database on other civilizations, on Muslim civilization, on European civilization. So we can't really quantitatively compare Europe with China, China with Islamic civilization.
Yeah.
But I think historians uh, have a view that Europe was in the dark age during that period of time, and Chinese invented so many technologies. The four biggest inventions were in China, right? Were Chinese. Francis Bacon referred to that. Karl Marx referred to that. And there's also evidence that China exported a lot of technologies to Europe. I mean, these are pretty crude historical evidence. So on the basis of that, historians believe China led the rest of the world in scientific and technological domain, right? So I will count that as the true golden era of China. Economists have a different timeline. They look at GDP. Um, there's the famous data set that shows that China was the biggest economy in the world as late as the 18th century, 19th century. Uh, the problem with that is the GDP data are really poor, and the recent research has actually challenged that view, and the more recent and better research, I would argue, shows that China was actually behind the West as early as 15th century, 14th century. But our technology indicator, I think, is more objective, more solid. On the basis of that, China peaked around 6th century, and then it began a gradual decline.
A couple of follow-up clarifying questions. First, I just find it amazing that you're debunking the generally accepted view that China's economy, speaking from a GDP perspective, was ahead of Europe's in 18th and 19th century. And it makes sense based on what you're saying, your objective analysis. But what I'm wondering is that comparison is to the whole of Europe. It's not by country. You're not these comparisons that, for example, China's GDP was ahead is not per country, like China to France, China to Sweden, China to Germany. Well, Germany was a lot of small states, or China to England, right?
Uh, yes and no. The more nuanced research actually shows comparison between the most developed part of China with the most developed part of Europe, right? And so by that comparison, uh, China lost its edge over Europe as early as possibly 14th century, 15th century in terms of the GDP measure,
I
right?
see.
And that actually coincides up with our data on technology. What we showed is that in the first, in 6th century, there was an initial decline, and then the technological development kind of plateaued, but
Uh
at a
huh.
fairly high level. And then by 14th century, there was another sharp decline, basically went down to zero, right? So it kind
Oh
of
wow.
coincided with this economic research and by the way, I want to clarify, I didn't do the GDP research. That was done by a economist at Oxford University. in
Hmm.
collaboration with the economists at Tsinghua University. I didn't do that. I just borrowed their insights.
Yeah. You mentioned other economists had
Yeah.
conducted these studies. My two follow-up questions, just for a point of interest for our audience. You said four biggest inventions in China before the 6th century. Uh, I think it would be fun to itemize it.
Yeah.
Item.
So yeah. So actually, one was before the 6th century, and we can come back to about these other three. So it's paper, compass, gunpowder, and printing. And
Ah,
yeah, so those are like the four, I would argue, biggest inventions in uh, history until the Industrial Revolution, for example. And um, and they were all Chinese. Every single one of them was Chinese. Right? Francis Bacon referred to them in his writing about technology. Although he talked about three inventions. He lumped paper and printing together, even
yeah.
though paper was invented well before printing.
This is really interesting because many of these were later widely used and improved on in Europe and North
Yeah.
America, such as printing and gunpowder and what have you, and paper. My last question, again, just a point of interest, is what were some of the major exports of China? I think I can come up with some porcelain, silk.
Yeah. So the tea, right? Tea was very
Yeah,
famous, and that potentially was one source of the Opium War because the British ran a trade deficit with China buying too much
exactly.
tea,
And they
and
couldn't
then
figure out how to make
they
tea as well as they did in China.
yeah. So then, well, they eventually figured it out in India,
Hmm.
and so that's why tea has a Chinese original name to it. So that was a very famous porcelain, right? That was exported to Holland, and Holland copied the Chinese technology, and by the way, improved upon it uh, substantially. Silk, um, but as you mentioned, these four technologies spread from China to Europe. And here is a very interesting contrast. They were invented in China, but their economic value happened in Europe. It is
Wow.
it is a little bit or economic or political value. It is exactly the opposite of what we are observing today. So if you look at electric vehicles, solar panels, right, nuclear energy, each one of those was invented in the West, right, in Germany and then in the United States. But they were deployed on massive scale in China to produce economic, commercial, and some people would argue even military values, right? So it's exactly the flip
It
of the
switched.
historical pattern. It's great, right? Um, and um,
Oh, wow.
and I just think that in and of itself deserves a whole book. It is fascinating, uh, fascinating phenomenon.
Um, wow, we could have an entire podcast on that. Before we go to the next segment, you said tea, the name comes from China. You mean the word tea comes from China?
It was
Yeah.
cha, right? Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So
I
that
thought,
no, that's Chinese. That's a Chinese word for tea.
wonderful.
Yeah.
We'll be back after a short break to talk about exams and autocracy. We'll be right back. Um,